Recording in progress. So welcome to lecture 3. This is our second part in lighting. And today we're going to be dealing with multiple lights and slightly more complicated geometry. We've got two different Maya project folders for you. We've actually got a still life folder. You've got a choice to do a standard still life like fruit bowl, cup, candle kind of deal. The other one is what we call the Cornell Rabbit, named after Cornell University. And that is, if you're not familiar with Cornell University, they were at the forefront of computer graphics research, I should say, in the 1970s. And they have done a lot of firsts. So the Cornell Rabbit is one of the first point cloud scans that were taken of a physical object. So a point cloud scan is basically a scanner that goes around, shoots points out, laser points out. They hit a surface. That surface tracks that point in 3D space. And once they're done shooting all those points on the object, then they triangulate it, making a mesh. And of course, they have to run an algorithm to clean up the triangulation process, making it into triangles. And the result is a fairly dense mesh, but that's not really that big a deal for us these days. And it's a pretty good scan. Still holds up pretty well. We also have a portrait, which is called a decimated head, which is basically from the shoulders right about here up. That was a 3D scan as well. And for that, we have the actual mesh, and we also have the skin texture that came with it. So for that scene, and that scene only, we have the Arnold materials placed on that portrait head already. The reason we have it is because we are using subsurface scattering to give the skin a little more realism. So if you have a backlight behind the ear, basically you will get that little bit of a glow like you normally get. So let me turn my light on. There we go on my phone. You probably can't see it, but you can kind of see my ear glow a little bit behind there. So that is subsurface scattering, where you have light passing through a surface. As it passes through the surface, it scatters. It doesn't make it out like a glass object. It comes out really, really scattered, and it picks up the color of what it is, whatever it's passing through. It could be wax, it could be soap, it could be skin. So just taking another screenshot, make sure I get everybody for attendance. All right, so office hours this week will be Tuesdays and Thursdays. It'll be 10 to 4 on Tuesday and Thursday. Frank and or Ari will be doing the Zoom Open Lab for us. That Zoom Open Lab is basically going to be for online and campus students both. So we can give you guys support, plenty of support in Discord, but a lot of times if we have more than one person show up, we definitely want to have Zoom because it's a lot easier to get more people to share the same screen and to interact than it is on Discord. Discord's okay for a few people, but nothing really complicated. All right, don't forget term ID for all SAL folders and files are 2021_06. All the deliverable information is inside each activity at the bottom for campus and online students. So I'm mentioning online because we have online students watching the archives here. Now, let us know if you find any errors or inconsistencies. We're always trying to proofread it before we get it out there, but you'd be surprised how many eyeballs go over stuff, and then, 3, 4, 5 months later, somebody will go, hey, is this right? No, it's not. How did we miss that? Okay, so attendance for campus students at Full Sail or in the live Zoom sessions and labs is expected. We are taking attendance. We are marking it down and passing it on to the registrars. Okay, if you are a campus students only, okay, if you cannot make the live sessions, you must watch the archives and send me a screenshot of the session that you're watching so I can give you attendance credit. If you have any questions, please message or email me. I did put this in the welcome letter, the welcome announcement, the welcome message. But I'm just reminding everybody. So campus students only, if you can't make the live sessions, you must watch the archives and send a screenshot to me for attendance of you watching the archive. Okay. Any questions before we go?
So the archive is for people who missed the class?
Yes, you must watch the videos, which is part 1 and part 2 of the class you missed. If you don't watch the videos, you're not going to be prepared to do the project.
Because I was wondering, because I thought for people to miss the lecture, I thought you were saying that people have to send a screenshot of them potentially watching the archive to do it.
Yes, that's what I just said.
Okay.
So you're taking a screenshot of you with it on your computer. So, it's basically you sending me a screenshot with that session open. You are saying, I watched this.
Okay.
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 Good question. Actually, excellent question. Thank you for asking that, Michael. Anybody else? Any other questions? Quiet bunch. Everybody's got their stuff on mute, it looks like. Okay, Michael's good. Good to go, Derek. Thank you. Tyra's good. Trying to get a little activity going here, get the blood going. All right, so I don't have to worry about this right now because I have 0 people in the classroom. So if we continue to have nobody in the classroom for the rest of the week, then we will probably suspend campus lectures, at least for the month anyway, because it's no point in me coming in here if I'm in here by myself in a big giant room. So we'll have to evaluate it. Got to run that by my department chair and of course, Pete Banstra, who is the program director. But that's kind of what we agreed to early on. If we don't get any campus participation, we'll just go back to doing virtual only, at least for that month. Do be aware that either in August or September, I'm not sure when it's going to happen, we will not be doing the live simulcast remote Zoom sessions. Now, normally I still run the Zoom sessions here because I use them to record. And this way, if there are issues, sometimes it's easier to share your screen doing that, especially since we're social distancing still. But I just wanted to let everybody know that's what's going on. Campus room etiquette, just a reminder, if you do come in, 3 feet of social distancing in the room at all times, everywhere at Full Sail inside. Must wear a mask inside all indoor environments on campus, especially in class. Wipe your station down before and after you're done. If you're sick, do not come to campus. You will need to fill out a disclosure confirmation form eventually, whether you come in this month or next month or whenever. I don't have to worry about reminding everybody about earbuds and headphones, but I am going to put my phone on mute. Just because if I don't do that, that'll be the one time I get a spam call. Okay. So if you guys have any questions, please let me know. Move everything down. So our agenda today, we're going to talk about soft lighting. We're going to talk about working with multiple lights. We're also going to talk about light linking that allows us to link up specific lights to specific objects or pieces of geometry. We're going to be doing some image analysis. We've got a free lighting portrait guide for you guys that you will download and use for the portrait part of our assignment today. So Ion said we have to be on campus during August. Unsure, Ion, you have to check Full Sail 1. They're saying August, but I've also heard it might be September. But keep an eye on Full Sail 1. They'll usually pop it into the main page, usually under events and the status. And you can also check with your advising staff, either your student advocate or your advisor. So that's all the information I have as far as what we're trying to do on campus. We know that June, July are kind of what we call soft openings. We're trying to get feel for how many people are going to come back to campus. And then Full Sail is trying to figure out how we're still working everything. So, good question. All right, so we are working with the principles of light. Anytime we're lighting, we're always working with those principles of light. Light direction, light intensity, light color, shadow quality, right? Hard light, small light, or a light far away. Soft light, big light, or a light that's fairly close to the geometry or the subject. Hello, Ari, how you doing?
Good morning, Tony.
Okay. Just take a screenshot real quick, make sure I get everybody. Okay. So we're going to be working with multiple lights, like I said, and we're going to try and make it as painless as possible. So the two exercises we have build upon each other. You do the still life first, because for the still life, it's all CG. We give you what are called lighting breakdowns, which mean we give you what each light looks like by itself. We give you a render. So this is what the key light looks like. There's your target. We do fill light if there is one, and there is a fill light. We do a fill light. This is what the fill light does. There's your target for your scene. Now, as you are working through all these different lights and the breakdowns, you will be putting your lights on a display layer so that when you're done the fill light, or I should say, when you're done the key light, you can put that light on a display layer and basically turn that display off. Turn that layer off so that then you can focus on the next light. When you're done the fill light, you do the same thing. You put that on a layer and you turn it off. So it makes it a little bit easier to think about and work on, because when we get to the portrait is not going to have breakdowns. It's basically going to have a diagram from the photographer. Hey, this is what I did. This is where my subject is, where the camera is, where the lights are. And that's it. As far as intensity goes, as far as color, as far as direction, you know, you don't get any of that like you do with a single breakdown. All right, so let's talk a little bit about, well, first off, let's talk about the different kinds of lights that we run into a lot. So for this shot right here, we actually shot this in our office. And this is basically a standard kind of still life / product shot. Now, we call it product shot because we have what are called softbox lights on either side of the subject. And that's what creates these interesting shapes in metal and in glass. So you can see that for the metal, which is a brushed metal thermal container here on the right, you can see those lights stretch and kind of wrap around the top of the cap of the metal thermos. On the left side, we've got a glass vase, clear glass vase, and you can see the shape of those soft lights, those big rectangular soft boxes. And by the way, soft boxes are equivalent to an area light. An area light would give us the same look. Now, for this to work, we'd have to turn on the light being visible to the camera, because we need the light to be visible in not only to the camera, but we need it to be visible in reflections. All right, so those lights, they call them soft boxes because in photography, and this is kind of a, you know, behind the scenes of how it was shot, you can see that we use what are called spotlights with a hood on it, and that hood is a very common thing to use in photography. You're basically using a light, and then you have a modifier for that light, like that big soft box, which will diffuse all those direct light rays that normally happen with a spotlight. So spotlight, the light rays are going to be conical, basically like they're shot out of a cone. So you can see here, this spotlight sitting on the floor, it's a bare spotlight, gives us this kind of sunburst or backlight effect behind the subject. Right? So that looks like that here in the final shot. Now, we have a lighting kit at Full Sail. We got about 5 of these lights, and we have 3 of these hoods that we can attach to the lights at any one time. So it makes the lights very flexible. We can use them as a hard light, which is what a bare spotlight is. But once we put this hood on it, this diffuser right here. And by the way, there's our spotlight. Okay, so what happens here? Well, we get all the light kind of going in different directions. It diffuses how the light comes out of that softbox. So it scatters it, it wraps around the subject, creating very soft shadows. So we have one on either side. So this scene, in effect, used 3 lights. We've got a backlight and we've got 2 side lights. Those 2 side lights are sort of, they both work like key lights. So this is our setup. This is the final result. Now, the reason I bring this up is because in this shot, I took this picture using the same camera settings, same light in the same position. The only difference was the one on the right, I used a bare spotlight. And the one on the left, this is a spotlight with a softbox hood. So think of that hood as turning a spotlight into an area light. So like I said, we have spotlights in Arnold and Maya. We have separate area lights, but in the real world, you know, it's really expensive to have one light and not be able to use it for anything else. We like to have things that multitask. So having a spotlight, we put a diffuser on it. That works really well. We can then use it as a softbox. Now, as you guys see, when we get into analyzing the portrait guide, we'll be talking about the different kinds of lights or the different modifiers that the photographer will use. We have a CG equivalent of that as a light by itself. So the difference between these two, like I said, the light is in exactly the same position. It's the same intensity. The camera was set up identically, or as close as I could get it so that the intensity looked the same. And, you know, the shadow position, everything matched as close as possible. So on the right, like I said, hard light, bare spotlight. We have a whole lot more detail in our shadows. On the left, it's much, much softer, meaning the shadow's a little blurry. It's faded quite a bit only because the light is being scattered. It's kind of like clouds on an overcast day for the sun. Now, let's take a close-up look at the detail on this little drive. So this would be a typical shot you would do for either Etsy, or if you're doing a catalog for like Newegg or something like that, where, you know, you need to photograph objects so that you can then sell them so people know what they look like. So, you know, not only would you have this shot, but you'd also have a side shot, a bottom shot, a back shot, a front shot. You know, you'd probably do several different positions of the object. All right, so let's zoom in a little bit, take a look at what we have going on here. All right, so for the spotlight, take a look at the detail that we have on the top of the drive case. Right, can clearly see the logo. If I zoom in a little bit more, should be able to see there's a really grainy top to the case. And you can see the side is smoother. but it's pretty grainy here. Whereas we contrast that with the softbox, and there's much less detail visible. Let me zoom out a little bit, see if we can see. No, probably not. All right, let's try that. All right, so you can clearly see where the logo is. It's a lot more subdued because that soft light is wrapping around the object, not really giving a hard positional indication of where the light's coming from. Remember, that light's scattered in all different directions, so we're not getting as much detail from our object. On the right, the light is more organized. The spotlight is more directional. It's coming out in a conical shape from the source, which is a light bulb. And we see shadow. We see more detail on the grain of the case and also the logo itself. So even on the USB symbol on the top of the cord, USB 3, you can see it here. It's a little more subdued here. It's a little harder to see. Now, it all depends on what you need your picture to do. Do you need it to show detail, or do you want to minimize detail? So for example, if you're showing an object that has a lot of detail modeled into it, or it's got a lot of detail that has been rendered into it, you will basically be able to see that detail a lot easier with a direct light. Direct light being a point light. You know, even though it shines in all directions, it's still going to have some directionality. A spotlight and a directional light. Now, an area light is like a softbox. It is meant to diffuse or soften that light, the larger it is. So remember, our lights, well, at least our area light, works more like a physical light source. Meaning if we make it bigger, it's softer. We make it smaller, it's harder. Right, does that make sense? Any questions? Okay, Derek's good, Michael's good. Tyra's good. Ion, any questions?
All good here.
All right, Will's good, thank you. Katerina, Jackson, Janelle, Kaylee, Kayvon. Katerina's good, thank you. Lauren, the Michaels, Ricardo, Tyra. I think Tyra, you said you were good. Yeah, you said you're good, thank you. Jackson's good, okay. No questions, thank you. Okay. So let's continue on. Soft lighting in cinema, unlike film noir being kind of very dramatic, in-your-face lighting, in-your-face storytelling, you know, traditional storytelling goes in, you know, peaks and valleys, right? You have a lot of drama, things subside for a little bit, you know, things seem to work out for a while, but then, you know, more conflict builds, and that makes for interesting stories. With soft lighting in cinema, we're lighting so that the story is primary, and we are only supporting the story. We're not trying to draw attention to the lighting to basically make the scene look too dramatic. Now, key to soft lighting, the way to describe it generally is going to be it's a gradient. a nice smooth transition between darks and lights. So it's also one of the key elements to creating believable CG. Now, not until the mid 19, or I would say early 2000s, when we started to develop these global illumination indirect bounce light systems, that our lighting really took on a realistic look. Prior to that, it was hit or miss. It took a lot of lights. Whereas now, we can pretty much throw a couple of lights in a scene, and the way the light bounces, the way the lights behave on the materials makes everything look so much more realistic. But this soft light that we kind of take for granted, that's our ambient kind of fill light that we're used to in our environments for most of the time. All right, so we have a couple of interesting things for you today. One is the lighting compass. All right, so all of this information is inside each it's inside activity 3. It's lesson 3.1. So if you come down here, I've got a link for lighting for digital photography. So you could right click, save it here. You could click on the link. It'll take you to the book, the digital photography book. And honestly, I would recommend reading these books if you're interested in creating good, believable lighting, because we learn a lot from photography. Like I've said, they've been doing it for, over 100 years. And why not learn from people who have done it already? And it's really not that difficult to take the concepts from digital photography or even traditional photography and bring them over to CG now, especially with our lighting systems that we have. I should say lighting, materials, rendering systems, because those three things are really what make everything work. So in this guide, it's really all about a couple of things. First, where is the camera? So the camera right here. Where is the subject? Right here. And the light is always based on that relationship. Camera, subject, light. Now, camera is always going to be pointed at the subject in some way. Yeah, we can have the camera off to the side. We can have the camera overhead. But still, the camera is looking at something. It's looking at our subject. Remember, it's all about those three things we need to make something visible. We need a camera or our eyes. We need a light, and we need something for the light to hit. And that's really what this is. It's kind of creating a little clock or a little compass on where the light falls in relation to the subject and the camera. So if the light falls within, a few degrees of the camera position, that is called on camera. Also, we called it front light for the most part, because the light is coming from the front and the shadows go towards the back. So if we have the light off to the side, one of the cardinal positions, like 90 degrees, that's going to be side light. Now, sometimes when you have light between 90 and 0, this would be 0 degrees. This would be 90. Okay, you have something like 45 degrees. Sometimes people will call that 3/4 light. right? Because usually the subject is illuminated, 3/4 of the subject is illuminated, and usually 1/4 is not. And remember, shadows are going to occur 180 degrees from that light. So again, it's all about where the camera is and the position of the light. Now, most of our key lights are somewhere within this 180 degree, 90 degrees right, 90 degrees left area. Why? Because, unless you're doing backlight for a specific effect, most of the time you're illuminating the front of the subject. Now, when we get around to anything past 90 degrees, we're more or less talking about light coming from behind the subject. So again, remember 180-degree rule. So if we've got light coming from back here, say 135 right or 135 left, right, we're going to have a shadow that's going to come toward the camera. Not quite as much as when we have direct backlight, because then the shadow comes directly at the camera, but it's still going to come toward the camera. Now, if you understand that part, and it kind of makes sense, then when we start adding in multiple lights, we would use the same lighting compass to figure out where a good starting point for a fill light or a backlight or a rim light might be. So again, we got our key lights somewhere in this area. So for example, if we have our key light at, let's say like 60 degrees, somewhere in here. So somewhere 60 degrees, we're probably going to have a fill light somewhere over here. Fill light's probably going to be somewhere around here. It might be 60 degrees left. It might be 45. It depends on what needs to be illuminated or what the key light was not able to get. Now, if we're going to do a backlight, a lot of times a backlight, so this is our backdrop. A lot of times what we'll do is we'll not necessarily illuminate the subject, but what we might do is illuminate the backdrop. This way, we've got a bright background that will help separate the subject from the backdrop, sort of like what we did here. Right? We stuck a backlight in there so that we had a nice bright backdrop that had a gradient, that had different kind of, color than the ground, or I should say that big piece of paper that we have to cut down the glare from our table. So it does help to separate the subject from the backdrop. So this would be kind of a backlight. Like I said, backlight sometimes can be a little confusing. You've got backlight that will illuminate or throw the subject in silhouette. And then we have backlight that lights the backdrop that the subject is in front of. And that also helps to create a little bit more mood and a little bit more separation. Now, if we don't use a backlight on the backdrop. You want to make sure that you've got your subject separated. All right, so let's say this is our key light. This is our fill light. We want to add a rim light. All right, so this side of the subject is going to be pretty bright. This side is going to be a little darker because our fill light's not going to be as bright as the key. And this, key light, the subject is going to block some of the backdrop over here a little bit more. Also, the fill light's not going to provide any spill or as much spill light as a bright key. So we might have our rim light somewhere around here. Now, rim light is aimed at the subject, and it's aimed so that we get the edge of the subject to be visible by that rim light. It's usually a small bright light that kind of carves an edge out of our subject and helps separate it from the backdrop. So use the lighting compass as a way to figure out where everything is in your composition, right? Remember, your camera is always pointed at the subject. That should be the center of interest for your scene. Now, center of interest, I don't mean it's got to be directly in the center of the frame, right? Remember, we still use the rule of thirds. So, I mean, you could put your subject here, here. You could use the golden mean, bring it around if you want to. But center of interest just means this is where all the focus is. So that helps to kind of point and guide the viewer where you want them to look first. Could be an environment, could be a single object, could be multiple objects. All right, does that make sense? Any questions?
No, I'm good, but thank you.
All right, Will's good. Thank you, Will. Okay, so Derek said, is it best to have a rim light opposite the key light? Usually, Derek, I would say it generally is, but it's not a hard and fast rule. Generally, if you're working like this, especially in the beginning, or if you're working for a company, you're either, lighting a game, a scene in a game, or you're lighting a still image, or you're lighting something for an animation. All right, usually it's going to be dictated by your reference. So, animator will go, hey, I want to have, this kind of lighting for my animation. I want to make sure it follows the character, and I want to make sure that the character is always separated from the backdrop, so the animation is clear to the audience or the viewer. And I want it to look like this. And they may give you an example of a movie or another animation. But if you have, so it's not set in stone. So if you have a chance to do it on your own, then artistically, you're going to have to decide where does it look best. Now, generally with a key light, say, for example, on the right side here, let me switch colors. Let's go to orange. So usually with a key light here, you'll get some spill. You get a little bit of spill coming into the backdrop here. So you probably don't need any rim light on this side. But here, remember, our fill light's not nearly as bright. The head is probably going to block, maybe even the shoulders will block some of the backdrop on the left. This is probably a good place to have it. But again, not a hard and fast rule. It's just a good place. Let's put it this way. Good starting point. You're welcome. Good question. Excellent. Anybody have any other questions? So let's take a look at the lighting guide that we have for you guys. The link for this is in lesson 3. So if you go into lesson 3 down to resources, click on it. It should take you here, and you should be able to right click on it and save image. Save image, throw it on your desktop for now. And there's mine right here. So let me double click and open it. And you say to yourself, okay, well, that's all fine and well. Doesn't look very impressive, but go into actual size. You'll see that it is a big scan full of all kinds of good information. So there's all kinds of lighting styles. A lot of them have a single light source. But for our exercise, you're going to pick one that has multiple lights in it. It's got to have at least 2 lights. You cannot do a single light portrait. All right, so in addition to having all these examples and diagrams and final render or photo, the photographer also provides, let me kind of pull this up a little bit. There we go. So the photographer also provides a legend at the bottom stating exactly what they're using and what the terminology is. So give everybody a second. I recommend downloading it so that we can talk about it, and you can look at yours while we talk about it. So again, go into the lesson 3.1 activity, go down to resources, click on it. That will bring up, well, it should bring up this page. And if it brings up a white background, still doesn't matter. You just right click on top of the image and you should be able to save image. Now I'm using Firefox. I know it works fine in Firefox. Chrome, Safari, I do believe it works okay there. But if it doesn't work in one browser, my theory is have at least 2 or 3 browsers. I've got Firefox, I've got Chrome, I've got Safari. That way, if one doesn't work, I will try the next browser. Because some browsers have, you know, a lot more security or a lot more cookie intervention. And you may not be aware that something is set to a high security level and it won't let you do something. We have that trouble with Autodesk once in a while also. Like sometimes Maya will not download properly in one of the browsers. All right, so we've got camera, pretty simple. We've got our Maya camera, so we don't have to really worry about that. Subject, yep, we're going to supply that. Backdrop, we're going to supply that. You really don't need to worry about them. Our backdrop is gray already. Like I said, for the portrait, we've already got the materials pre-assigned to the head and also to the backdrop. So for this one, it's just a matter of opening it up. First, make sure you set your project because there is a texture involved with the head. If you do not set your project correctly, that texture will be missing. So set your project first. Open your scene file. You're not really going to be able to see it in the viewport very well. And like I said, this one, you're going to work on after you do your still life. But let's talk about what the lights are now. So for the lights, let me kind of come over here. And let's just pull this over. make it just a little smaller. There we go. That way we can fit everything in. All right, so couple things for terminology. Javier said it broke his Safari. So the strobe with a reflector, right? Strobe with a reflector is simply a spotlight for us. Right? It is simple, it's effective, and the reason they call it a strobe is, if anybody's ever done any photography, a strobe means that the light is only turned on when the shutter is pushed down. The light stays on for the length of the time that the camera shutter is open. Open meaning allowing light in for the camera sensor. Once that shutter closes, the light goes off. Now, generally with a strobe, you click it, the flash usually goes off like, a nanosecond before the camera actually starts to record. So it kind of gets rid of the red eye in theory. So a strobe with a reflector, think of that as a bare spotlight. Now, next to it, we've got a strobe, which again is a spotlight with a honeycomb. Okay, that honeycomb is this little piece of generally non-flammable plastic or metal that clips over the top of the reflector or the strobe cone. It's got a honeycomb pattern with openings. Anybody want to take a guess? What do you think that little pattern would do in front of the light? Splits it, makes it more soft, as in adding shadow. Okay, Javier, Michael, you guys are really close. It really does soften the light, not necessarily adding shadow. It just kind of splits the direct light rays a little bit. That little bit of an opening, or the multiple little openings with a little bit of a pattern in it will soften the light ever so slightly. So basically, this is like, similar to a softbox hood, but not nearly as dramatic. It is a much more subtle effect. And actually, you'll be able to see that, I believe, inside a couple of these examples we're going to go over. All right, so this would be a spotlight. And how would we soften the light a little bit in a spotlight? No, we're not going to use a hood, Michael. Because that would change the light a lot. We're talking about in CG. How would we soften the light in CG? We already know how they're doing it in photography. They're adding this little honeycomb attachment to the front of the light. So think, how did you make your shadows softer in the spotlight exercise for project 2? What did you have to do? There's a control, a rollout, or I should say, it's control in the Arnold rollout portion of the spotlight. No, you wouldn't change intensity because that would change the principles of light. Yes, Michael said the radius. That's right. It would be the radius control. Remember, when you make a bare spotlight, the radius is set to 0, which gives you really hard shadows. So let's take a look at this real quick. Just to kind of refresh everybody. Make sure we're all on the same page and we're all using the same, because the terminology can be a little confusing. Okay, got to wait for everything to load before I can resize Maya. RenderMan, come on, Arnold. There we go. All right, so let's do this. Let's pull this up. And let me turn my heads up display off. Don't need object detail. So just going to make a single polyplane, single sphere. Doesn't have to be anything incredible. We're just looking to demo how a spotlight works. So going to select both objects, Shift T to assign an Arnold AI standard material. And I'm going to turn off reflectivity, which is specular weight 0, base color 0.5. Let's create a spotlight. Let's pull it up. I'm going to hit the T key for that interactive manipulator. And let's do a quick render in Arnold. Needs more intensity. Make my cone a little bit bigger. And let's bring it up a little. Let's bring it over. Okay, good. All right, so there is my bare spotlight. The edges of that shadow are super hard. Let me do a quick little smooth here. There we go. Now it's not quite so faceted. All right, so bare spotlight. Now let's go into the spotlight attributes. Spotlight attributes, we want to go down to the Arnold rollout down here. And here is our radius. The radius of 0 means that spotlight is infinitely small in space. So let's increase the radius. So, well, let's go to 1. Once I go to 1, you can see that now my shadow has softened quite a bit. Look at the edge of the light here, right? Here's the spotlight. Now, when I softened it, it kind of wraps around the subject a little more. Now, this would be pretty dramatic considering, I don't know, let's see. This is probably more equivalent to what, probably even a little more. This is probably more equivalent to what a honeycomb would do to a spotlight, a real spotlight in the real world. Would soften the edges just a little bit, so you don't have those razor sharp shadows. All right, does that make sense? All right, good. All right, so now we come back a strobe with a snoot. Now, I know it sounds like something right out of South Park, but a snoot is actually a way to make the cone of a reflector or a strobe smaller. So basically, these little rings, you can, add more, take more away, and each little ring makes the light pattern a little smaller. So it does not have any, diffuser in it unless there's a little cap that comes with it. But generally, these are just a way to resize, your strobe. Now, in Maya, it's simple. We've got a slider for the cone angle. So, let me go back to Maya here. So I'm going to set my radius back to 0. And I can adjust my cone angle. So by default, I get a 40, which is 40 degrees. If I want to make it smaller, I don't need to add a snoot or anything to it. I can just drag my cone angle down until I get the size that I want. So basically, snoot would be equivalent to a spotlight with cone angle adjusted. All right, so we've got a bare spotlight, or the strobe with the honeycomb is spotlight with the radius adjusted, strobe with the snoot, spotlight with the cone angle adjusted. And now we're into the area lights. So whenever you see a strobe with a softbox, think Arnold area light. That will provide pretty much the same thing that a softbox does. So let me go back to Maya here. Take my spotlight, and we're just going to hide that, which is Control H. And let's create an Arnold area light. So don't forget Arnold area lights. They have the little pointer, and they are much more sophisticated than Maya area lights. So let's give it some energy. You can see right out of the box, standard size, it creates a fairly soft looking light. Now, if we need to make it visible to the camera, don't forget, you can do that under visibility. Turn that on. But there are basically no references for the portrait that have a visible light. But should you need it to be visible, works perfectly well. And it's only visible to the camera. It doesn't change the lighting at all. All right, let's go back to our portrait guide. So now we get into the reflectors. These are ways to create bounce light, ways to create fill light, or soft key light, but a little bit harder than the area light or the strobe. I'm sorry, with a little bit harder than the softbox and softer than the honeycomb. So now a lot of lighting kits use what's called a shoot-through Brawley instead of a softbox. So when you have the light going through this, it acts a lot like the softbox. You can also aim it so that it reflects back. This one you will do too. This will go through and also reflect. This one has a black backing on it, and this one will bounce light back only. It will not let light through. Now, whenever you see a bounce card or some kind of object that is reflecting light back into the scene, in CG, think extra light. Our lighting systems are not advanced to the point where we can track real-world energy through the entire life cycle of a light ray as it bounces in our environment. I mean, we're talking billions, trillions, quadrillion of bounces that we take for granted. You know, we may get into millions and billions of bounces in CG, but it is pretty expensive, meaning it takes a while to render. So it's much easier and much more controllable to use another light whenever you see a reflector. Does that make sense? So whenever you see a silver reflector here, think additional light. Any kind of bounce card, anything along those lines, think extra light. Now, silver reflector, what could we use as a replacement in CG? What kind of light? So Derek says area light. Okay. So that is definitely one of them. Now, if you take a look at the shape, you can say, all right, AI area light. AI area light for the softbox, I would leave that as a quad. Here, we could change this into a disk. It's not really going to change the type of light, but it will change the shape of it. So for example, let me kick this off again. So this is my quad shape area light. So to change the shape, come down here underneath color temperature, and let's change it to a disk. All right, so did it change anything? It changed the light a little bit. If you take a look at the shadow, this is my quad, this is my disk. So let's make the light visible to the camera. There we go. And let me go back to quad, keep it displayed. All right, so here's my disk, here's my quad. Changed the light shape just a little bit, the shadows just a little bit different. So my recommendation is, if you see in your reference, they're using a reflector, use an area light, but make it a disk shape, because the photographer is probably using a round reflector for a reason. They do make square reflectors, bounce cards, they make them in all kinds of different shapes. Square or rectangular is very common, and actually disc is the second most common shape. Now, the reason we want a area light is because whenever you bounce light off of something, you are diffusing it slightly, even if it is a silver reflector. And usually a silver reflector has some kind of coating on it, so it diffuses the light. It doesn't make it like a mirror. Does that make sense? All right, Michael's good, Derek's good. All right. Now, let's talk a little bit about, before we move on, let's talk a little bit about this shoot through Brawley. So I've got an image here of what a shoot through brolly looks like. So if anybody needs to take a screenshot of this stuff right here, because I'm going to get rid of it so we can look at the shoot through brolly. So I don't want it to get in the way of what we're looking at here. All right, now, for this shoot through brolly, you'll notice that we've got a strobe, probably a battery pack or sand, sandbag to keep the light stand steady. And we got light going through it. And we've also got light coming, reflecting back. Now, which one does it do? It looks like there's a little more light being reflected back. It's much brighter here than it is right here. It looks like it kind of diffuses a little more when it's, being shot out rather than being bounced back. But it does the job, and it gives you an opportunity to either have the light reflect, or you can shoot through it onto your subject. So it's a little bit of a, I guess, it cuts the intensities ever so slightly, enough where you might be able to use it as a fill light in one direction and a key light in the other. Now, I've got a real simple photography kit at home, and my lights use this all the time. In fact, I don't have soft boxes. I just have shoot-through brollies. So either way works. Depends on what you're doing. Now, here's the million-dollar question. What do we use in CG as an equivalent? What light or lights do we use in CG? Now, we're talking about CG, computer graphics. We're not just talking about computer animation. We're talking about game art. We're talking about film. We're talking about TV. We're talking about, if you're doing simulation, you're doing accident reconstruction, you're doing medical visualization, you're still trying to decide what you want to use. All right, so Michael, Derek, and Ion say a point light. Now, I would agree because a point light is omnidirectional, but there's always a but, isn't there? Take a look at this slight bit of a void that we have right in this area. Not quite as bright as it is over here on the right or the left. Now, would a point light do that for us? Yeah, no, it's really not going to do that. So let me go back to my Maya scene here, and let me duplicate this ground plane. And let's just rotate it 90 degrees. Is that what I want to do? 90. And I don't feel like reversing the normals. It's up here. So 180. So let me shove this back. And let me duplicate this again. I'm just trying to do kind of a room, sort of like what our All right, so there we go. So let's do, let me hide this. Let's create a point light. I mean, let's just explore all the possibilities here. So we got a point light right here. So let's pull that up. Let's stick that back here. Too bright. Oh, yeah. There we go. So we got our point light. And I could stick it over top. You know, but a point light is not really going to give me what I want. So if I stick it back here, it's going to illuminate this direction. If I put it here, it's going to illuminate that direction. Now, I could, I guess in theory, add another point light. So let's add another point. Let's give that the same energy. So now I'm starting to get a little bit of a void there. Almost like I would if I were using a softbox, or not a softbox, sorry, a shoot-through brolly. And let's take these lights, let's kind of move them down here a little bit more. Nah, forget it. Let's just look at what we've got here. Now, part of the problem is, you know, we've got two separate lights, but that's not really how a shoot-through brolly is going to work. Shoot-through brolly is going to be aimed at your subject. So let's pull these lights together. Now, I can't really tell what they're doing because they're both doing the same thing. So maybe if I turned one down really low, turn the other one down really low. I'm still not getting that void in the middle. So two area lights. Yeah, I kind of like that, Michael. That's a good idea. Let's try that. So let's get rid of these points. And let's create an Arnold area light. And let's make it, since our shoot-through brolly's round, let's make it so that we have a disk. And let's create another one. Let's spin this one around 180 degrees. And let's make this one a disk also. All right, so let's give this, well, let's go 10 and see what we get. Ah, there we go. Now we're starting to get that void. So now if I took my sphere and kind of stuck that in the middle, well, for one thing, you don't want to have your geometry stuck inside. But we're getting a lot closer to what we would really have if we had a shoot through brolly. Now, obviously, with a shoot through brolly, they probably rotate the lights a little more. So 2 area lights would work. And honestly, we could probably get away with a couple of spotlights if we took the time to work with them. Right? So we got a spotlight here. Let's crank it up to 10. Let's make the cone bigger. Let's make it softer on the edges, penumbra. Let's do a little drop off here. And we could create another one and pretty much do the same thing. Now, in Maya, you'll notice I am not duplicating lights. Maya does not like you duplicating lights. It is very, very fickle. Come on. There we go. So let's see. It's 107. Now for this one, yeah, you might have a little interesting kind of overlap going on here. Trying to figure out how to do that. But it is possible to use a couple of area or a couple of spotlights. Now, in theory, we could also do our spotlights from off to the side. So for example, I could come over here. Let's pull this out. Let's make this a little smaller. So 35, oops. Let's bring that down to 35 too. Yeah. There we go. Let's make that a little bigger. There we go. So 2 spotlights might actually work. Something like that. Now, obviously, I would need some ambient light in here to be able to get some bounce going on. Probably want everything to be a little bit brighter. But does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, Will's good. All right, now, the last light that we looked at, or the last kind of diffuser, is the silver Brawley. So the silver Brawley just reflects light back. It does not allow light to pass through. So you don't have to worry about light being double-sided. Now, with the silver Brawley, you could wind up using the same thing we did for the reflector. Could be a disc, could be a spotlight if it's soft enough. It's really about what makes the most sense and what is the easiest to use. What's going to give you the best results? So let's take a look at the effect of some of these lights. Now, the first row is all the same shot. It's a typical Rembrandt portrait shot. Now, if you guys aren't familiar with Rembrandt, the painter, he was really a genius with light. And he was able to translate that light into canvas and oil. Most photographers utilize his techniques because he was so good at it. Now, this first one, Rembrandt with a softbox, Rembrandt used to sit his subjects near a window, a big open window. Window probably in the shape of a rectangle or a square, or maybe even had a little arch on top. But the light would come in from one side. So he would, move his subject so that both eyes were visible, because remember, the nose is going to cast a shadow. And the light side of the head is also going to cast a shadow. But the bridge of the nose will allow some of that light through, so you can have both eyes visible. So this became a very pleasing position for Rembrandt to have for his portraits, to show the subject in the best possible way. So a couple of things when you are looking at a portrait. We've got landmarks. All right, so first off, here's our camera, 0 degree. Here's our subject, camera aimed at subject. So we can see our first example. In fact, this whole first row, we've got basically left 45 degrees. Right, light coming in from the left side of the subject. So a couple of things that you can use on portraits, which really, really help a lot. Okay, so one of them is the direction and elevation of the light. So take a look at the shadow from the nose. The nose shadow does not go straight across. It comes down, which indicates that the light is slightly above the subject. Now, take a look at where the highlight is in the eye. So we kind of have what I like to call the horizon line of the eye, which is like the center point. You can see that highlight is right above that. So now we know that our light is 45 degrees left, slightly elevated above our subject. So use these landmarks. Take a look at your subject. Look at where the shadow from the nose is. That's a really good marker. If you get the nose shadow, the lips, the chin, they usually all fall into place. And you can usually tell where the light is in the highlight also. So these two will confirm light is above the subject a little bit. So this is a standard softbox, okay, or a big open window. This would be our area light. So we move on to the next one, and the next one is basically light in exactly the same position, but instead of having a softbox, we've got a shoot-through Brawley. Now, you can see that there's slightly more light from the shoot-through Brawley sneaking its way around to the side. We've got a little more illumination in the ear area and in the hair. Also, the backdrop is slightly brighter. So this is white fabric, just like the softbox, but notice the softbox has dark sides. So the light is a little more directional. This one is kind of hemispherical. So the light kind of fans out a little bit more and wraps around our subject. We've still got the same shadow. Look how much softer that shadow is here from the nose. It's still in exactly the same position, right? We're still coming down, and we've still got that horizon line here where the light is slightly above the subject. So all they really did was take off the softbox hood, put on a shoot-through brolly, but you can see the quality of the light has changed. So here, light is in exactly the same position. Take off the shoot-through brolly. All they did was clip on a honeycomb, and that honeycomb gave us those slightly, softened shadows. It's much harder light. This would be equivalent to like film noir. Notice that the light is a lot more focused. It hits the subject's head, doesn't bleed around to the backdrop very much at all. We've still got light in the same direction. We still got it coming from above because we still have these little markers here. The nose shadow points down. It doesn't point across the face. And the highlight in the eye is slightly above that center line in the eye itself. But the cone is a lot smaller, so it's more focused on our subject. So now we've taken a silver brolly, right? So the silver brolly, it's in exactly the same position, but all the photographer did was flip it around opposite direction and allow that silver brolly to bounce light onto the subject. Now, the fact that it's silver, notice how much cooler and colder that subject looks. The subject is pale and fair anyway, but downright, well, almost anemic looking, because that silver light really cooled off any warmth that was in the light itself. So you can see we've actually changed the mood. This is kind of the photography technique they use when they want to show things being bleak and very, very severe. It kind of evokes an emotional response in the viewer, subconsciously or consciously. So still got our nose shadow the same direction. We still got that highlight above the eye, but the backdrop is much more illuminated. Let me zoom out a little bit more here. See if we can get them all in. So you can see the difference. It's the same light direction, but notice the quality of the light has changed. Still 45 degrees left, but how the light behaves on the subject matters. All right, does that make sense? Questions? Anybody? Michael's good, no questions, okay. Awesome. All right, so now let's go back to line 2 here. So now slightly different technique. This is called a Rembrandt short, which means the broad side of the head, the subject has the shoulders facing the camera. They're kind of parallel, not parallel, but the body's turned so the shoulders are level with the camera. The head is turned. The broad side of the head is in shadow, but the short side, the part that's mostly facing away from the camera, gets the illumination. This is almost perfect side light, but not quite. Softbox. Notice we still have a nose shadow coming down. So the light looks different, but it's not really behaving any differently. We still have the light slightly above the center line of the eye. It's just a different lighting style. All right, so the Rembrandt broad, we've switched it over. So now the broad side of the head is the side that's illuminated. So whereas this one would have been probably 70, 75 degrees left, not quite 90. 75 degrees left. Now we're kind of 30, 35, 40-ish, not quite 45 right. We still have the nose shadow going down, which means the light is slightly above. So here, this one is a split. This is perfect side light, and it is perfectly level with the head. Look at the highlight in the eye. It goes right through the center of the eye. Now, this light spills around to the backdrop and to the front, but it splits the head in half. Now, this exact same situation is then augmented with a fill. So we still have the same light from the split, but now they've added in a reflector, and that reflector acts as a fill. So now it looks completely different. Both of these, the key light on the left and the reflector on the right, are parallel with the subject. You can see the highlights in the eyes. So key light, brighter, fill light, less intense. This would be acceptable for one of your, if anybody wanted to do this for your portrait. The other ones are not, because they only show a single light. You must have two visible lights in your reference. Does that make sense? Two visible lights in your reference. Okay, good. Just want to make sure. So let's continue on. Now we have a split short. So a split, remember, is cutting the subject in half. We've got a short, which means that we've got short side splits exactly in half. So it's a little bit different than the short over here, where some of the light gets around. This is all side light. So now we have a split broad, right? So here's our broad over here, but it's split. It's not quite 90 degrees. It's about 70, 75 degrees. It illuminates most of our subject like it does here, but the fact that it's so far around to the side creates more shadow on the left side. So here's a key with a close softbox. So you can see that the key with this close softbox, the nose shadow is really small. So that means that our light is fairly close to being on camera. Not exactly close, I mean, because then we wouldn't have any shadow on the nose, but it's pretty close, and it's also level with the head. So now we pull the light back. Pull the light back. Now we've got a little more pronounced shadow from the nose. It looks like it's ever so slightly above the subject now, because that highlight is a little bit lower. I'm sorry, a little bit higher here and lower over here. When it was closer, it was lower. They pulled it back, looks like it got raised up a little bit. We got a little bit of a nose shadow pointing not quite down, but not quite level. Pull it away from the subject, it allows more light to hit the backdrop. So a loop, they call this a loop because up top here we had a closed triangle of light. But here we've got an open. Right? So it says the shadow from the nose should create a loop pointing toward the corner of the mouth, right here. Whereas up here, we didn't get that. That was all connected. So just another style. We've got it probably 35, maybe 40. It's slightly above. Just a little bit above. So now a butterfly, this is where the light is above the subject. Look, we have shadow underneath the chin, but not much shadow on the face. A little bit of shadow under the lips, little tiny bit of shadow under the nose. This tells you the light is above and almost directly in the center of the subject. Front light, basically. Now, from this point on, anything from flat light on uses more than one light and is acceptable to use for your portrait. So here, flat light, this is basically 2 key lights, 45 degrees on either side. This is what you would probably do for somebody if they wanted a headshot to be used for theater or film or TV or, an actor. It shows, it shows the face pretty clearly, so there's no hidden parts of it in a shadow. Now we take this same light and flip it around the back, and now we've got Wolverine. You'll notice it's like 135 left, 135 right. The lights do overlap in the front a little bit. Take a look at, we have virtually no shadow under the chin. So you want to make sure when you're doing this, if you decide to do it, you might actually need to bring these lights around to the front a little bit more, because our CG lights don't quite behave the same way real world lights do. Remember, we're going by the position here as a starting point, but we're going by the final picture for our render, so our object looks the same. So you can see, well, makes perfect sense when you look at it, but always go by, hey, does my render look like that? I got my lights in the right position. Yeah, but does your render look like that? No, bring them around the front, a little bit more towards the side, maybe 120 left, right, just to get it to overlap correctly like we have in the reference. Clamshell, light above, light below. Kind of like this kind of deal. So very, very similar to the butterfly. In fact, it is one of the lights from the butterfly, but we have no shadow underneath. So both front light, above and below the subject, to kind of evenly light them. All right, so now we've got kind of a standard. This would be sort of a standard Rembrandt. It's almost it's almost 45 left. That's your key light. Notice the key light is slightly above, the nose shadow points down, it's above the center line of the eye, but now we have a backlight behind the subject, creating this really nice gradient. That is what you're going to look for. Where's the center of that light? Most people would think, oh, center of the head. No, it's down a lot lower. Spotlight does that. Spotlight's perfect light for that. You got the cone angle, you've got the penumbra, which is the softness of the edge, and you have drop off. All right, so now we've got the same light set up, but they flip the light around from the backdrop and aim it at the subject. Now, here's the thing. With this, they flip the light around. It looks like it's coming into the center of the subject's head. But where does it show up more? Does it show up equally on both sides? Does it show up more on the left, more on the right, more on the top? You have to look at where it is actually illuminating. So which side dominates the rim light? Anybody? What side's the rim light on? Yep. Her left, our right. So if you put your light in a position and you've got too much rim spilling on the left, you gotta move it over to the right a little bit more. You know, so in CG, we probably would have something like this. To be able to get this effect. All right, so now we've basically got the backlight, we've got the key light, and now they've added a reflector. This is called high key. High key usually means there's no shadow or very minimal shadow on the subject. Everything is super bright. Very, very little shadow. So backdrop washed out. Subject close to being washed out, but still, you know, separated from the backdrop. But this is a really super bright environment. All right, so key and fill. Key light on the left side, fill light on the right. Remember, we're still getting key light shadow here from the nose, slightly above, but it looks like our fill light is slightly below the subject. So we got our key highlight, and we've got our fill highlight. And notice they pull it back further from the subject, which makes it less intense. So now, same lighting setup, but they add what's called a kick light, which is really just an accent light on the hair and top of the ear. Not enough for that subsurface scattering effect where you've got the rim light going through the ear, but enough so it adds a little bit of an accent. Now, this one should look fairly familiar. This one takes the same concept as the Badger. The only difference is they add in a hard light. And notice they're using a hard light, and they're not saying that it has a, it's got a honeycomb on it. It's very razor hard shadow here. So we've got the backlighting from the Badger, but we've got front light as the key light to provide illumination. Now, this last one, this one can be really confusing, and it is one of the hardest ones to do. So, if we take a look at this, the key light is right here, right? That provides our main light source. You can see it as the highlight in the eye. You know, it's slightly above the subject. It's got a honeycomb on it. It looks like, at least that's what the picture has. It's got a honeycomb. So there is your key. So over here on the right side, this is your fill. Now notice the fill light is red. And also notice that the fill light generally is like coming sort of from the back. It's not quite side. It's more like 95, 100 degrees towards the back. Now for this, you know, it's pretty bright, but that color really makes it hard to see how bright it is. But what you want to look for is nice, even, dark red lighting. Now in photography, they don't change the light bulbs. They put what's called a gel or a non-flammable translucent plastic piece of material that's already colored. So we've got fill light. We've got a backlight, which is blue, providing the light behind the subject. So there's our back. We've got a rim light, which is pink. That's providing the rim right here. Got a little bit on the eyebrow, but that's okay. And we've got this reflector. So think of this reflector as a fill light, but also helps to keep the red fill from spilling over. So this works with the key light. This helps to keep the fill from spilling over into the front of the head. Also helps to keep the rim light toward the back of the subject, so that pink doesn't wind up spreading too far into the face. So this is one of the harder ones, but always start with the key light first. Always. Main light source, main shadow. All right, so one more time, we're going to go over what is acceptable to use for your portrait today. And you must use one of these images. So, can't use any of the first row. They're only single light. The only one you can use in the second row is this one right here. This one is good. These are no. So again, single light, single light, single light, single light, single light, single light. So none of these. Until we get here. You get into flat light. Anything with more than one light visible in the reference is acceptable to use for your portrait. Does that make sense?
Yes.
All right, awesome. Thanks, Will. Okay, Michael's good, Tyra's good, Derek is good, Kayvon is good, Ion's good, thank you. Katerina's good, thank you. Javier's good, awesome. All right, so this is a good time to take a break. We'll take a break, take a 20-minute break. That'll give me a chance to render out the first part of the lecture. And what we'll do is when we come back, we'll demo some more. And we're going to talk a little bit about light elevation. It's pretty simple. We're going to talk about light elevation. We're going to talk about light linking and going to do a demo for the rabbit that will allow you to see how light linking works. And then we'll take a crack at one of the portraits just to kind of show you the workflow and the approach to working with the portrait and the actual geometry that we give you guys. All right, so Let's go on break and come back at 9:20. They'll give me a chance to render out the first part of lecture. So I will see you guys back here in 20 minutes. Have a good break. I have to end the session as usual so I can render out lecture.